Hi guys, another blog video commentary from bitcoinbuildify.com. So the title of this one is Fiat Currency versus Cryptocurrency. What's the big difference? This difference in what they are is one of the biggest between the traditional system of finance and the crypto system of finance. So this is actually a really important point, and I've done my best to kind of outline it, but it's a vast thing. You could literally write books on this. So bear with me, and I'll try to get us through it here as clearly and kind of concisely as possible. So first, I kind of did a slight aside here when I wrote this post because it was just a few days before the G20 summit was due to start. So this was published on the 16th of March. And we're right now in the middle of the summit. It's already the 20th here in Japan. And according to recent news, it looks like they're going to let cryptocurrencies kind of do their thing. They don't feel they're a threat to the global economy at this point, which is very good news. I'm very happy to hear that because I believe in this platform for a variety of reasons, and I'm happy to see that the official powers that be are kind of letting it be, leaving it be, you could say. So the last thing I'll mention about it is this bit here, which I quoted from the article. You can actually read the agenda here if you click through to the blog. Fact: the technology behind crypto assets has the potential to promote financial inclusion. That's a huge statement. That's an amazing thing. That's absolutely true about them. At the same time, however, it is important to analyze its implications to financial stability, tax evasion, and financing illegal activities, which is again another fair point. They're not saying they want to smash it on the spot. They're saying they need to analyze its implications, right? And these three areas: financial stability, tax evasion, financing illegal activities, are massive in no matter what economy you're talking about. So first off, we need stability, right? You need to be able to have a currency that you can use day after day and won't suffer from some wild fluctuations in value or the technological platform it's on. So I understand that. Tax evasion, again, the government's run off taxes, like it or not. They need tax revenue to keep things going. Everything from officials' salaries to the roads and schools. So they need to make sure they can have at least some kind of oversight over what's happening. And then financing illegal activities, which of course is always an issue. But I don't know if cryptocurrencies really do make it any... Oh, I suppose on a smaller level, they would make it somewhat easier to finance illegal activities. On the grand scheme, though, come on, who are they trying to kid? But, be that as it may, it's good to see that they're going to let them do their thing for the time being. So, well, some may consider this something akin to the man moving in on their game, or the government otherwise attempting to clamp down on the currently unregulated crypto markets. I would instead see it as a sign that cryptocurrencies are finally being taken seriously by the most powerful countries in the world, which is true. They wouldn't be talking about it at the G20 summit, unless it were worth talking about. These guys don't exactly have a lot of free time, to say the least. Okay, to the main subject. Fiat versus crypto. What's the difference? Okay, fiat currency is the financial system used in the US and most other countries in the world, and cryptocurrency, a rising technology that shows promise of completely revolutionizing how money works. So first, let us set our definitions. Fiat currency is currency that a government has declared to be legal tender, but is not backed by a physical commodity. The value of fiat money is derived from the relationship between supply and demand rather than the value of the material that the money is made of. So it's essentially a representation of the currency and not the currency itself. This used to be literally true in the US up until 1973 was the final blow, where the US dollar was taken off the gold standard for international transactions in 1973. But it had actually been removed from the gold standard for national or international transactions, you might say, in 1933. Before that, each bill was actually a representation of an amount of gold it was redeemable for. So it was a slow transition from actual gold to bills representing gold to purely just bills, which represent basically the authority of the government to enforce the agreement to use them as a currency. Really, though, they're an IOU. Fiat currency is essentially summoned into existence purely by the power of authority. There is no inherent base to the currency, as there is nothing to back it in the way of gold or some other commodity. It is essentially monopoly money. So I'll leave it at that. It's a little more involved and complex than that, but the essential tenets hold true. Governments that have a fiat economy make the money, and the banks that control, or I should say help facilitate the flow of the money, take it a step further with fractional reserve banking. It has its uses. It can help economies expand incredibly quickly, and which is a good thing. Gold would have to be like immeasurably valuable to actually have our current economy based off of it. But it also has its downsides, and you can learn more about that here in this article. Alright, so that's what fiat currency is. Cryptocurrency is a digital currency in which encryption techniques are used to regulate the generation of units of currency and verify the transfer of funds, operating independently of a central bank. So, it's okay. Yes, it's basically just software, but the nature of the software is very, very different from what central banks use. And it essentially creates a distributed network that is identical to everyone on it, and is also highly, highly secure, and affords a much greater degree of independence. And depending on the nature of the currency, in this case, we're going to be focusing a lot on Bitcoin because that's kind of, well, it is the original cryptocurrency, and it's also kind of the best template for the most, what's the word? Kind of the best template for the best model of cryptocurrency. There are so many varieties out there, so it's really difficult to just say this is what a cryptocurrency is. There's every day they're coming out with different ones, and Google's actually going to be cracking down starting of June this year, because it's getting out of hand, and it's beyond the point where the average consumer can be expected to know what's legit and what's not. So that's really saying something when Google's saying, alright guys, look, wait, stop. So anyways, Bitcoin is going to be our main model for this article. So aside from being a secure distributed network, Bitcoins, if you will, the units themselves, are impossible to duplicate. So you could almost think of Bitcoin as a kind of digital gold, in that it has an incredible amount of value, and it's an incredible store of value. And it's, in the case of Bitcoin, it's impossible to duplicate. With gold, you can't duplicate it, but it's very, very difficult to get an equal amount of whatever, of any gold really. It's expensive, and you have to get it out of the ground. And a lot of it is registered somewhere, so Bitcoin actually takes it a step further. Let's So we've basically established what the difference is here. Fiat currency is basically monopoly money, the amount of which can be controlled artificially by a very small minority in power. Cryptocurrency is essentially a protocol, an internet protocol. In the case of Bitcoin, the amount of which cannot be controlled artificially, and given its distributed network, there's no central point of control. It's really controlled by a community, and each holder of Bitcoin, or hodler, as you might also hear them called, has exclusive control over their own Bitcoin. So it's very different from our current system. Okay, I'm going to skip this part. I don't really know if this even belongs in the blog. It's basically just breaking down the different kind of groups involved with cryptocurrencies. I haven't really completely finished editing this, so I might be moving this elsewhere. Let's skip down to why are cryptocurrencies seeing such a rise in popularity and media attention. So this is kind of tying into the fact of the conflict between fiat and cryptocurrencies. So there's probably a few reasons why they're coming to the forefront. First and foremost, they're a new technology and proving to be a very functional one too, to say nothing of how much money people are making with them. So the money-making thing may at some point come to pass when things stabilize, but for the time being, there's money to be made in trading and whatnot. So second is that cryptocurrencies are rather controversial. They're unregulated right now, and that means if you know what you're doing in the markets, you stand to win a lot. If you don't, you stand to lose a lot. It's kind of the Wild West of finance right now. But it's still very, very interesting. So they're kind of the maverick or the black sheep, right? Nobody really knows what's going to happen. And continuing with that, it's important to be really careful if you choose to get involved with them. There's a huge variety. So at one extreme we have what are absolutely amazing works of technological innovation. Platforms like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Cardano have a real mission behind them, and each fulfill a need based on the projects that preceded them. So Bitcoin started off as a very egalitarian minded project that solved some very serious problems with currencies in very simple and elegant ways, and was very obscure in the beginning. I mean, most of us had heard something about it, but very few of us took it seriously, unfortunately. I wish I had. But that kind of vector of a template that's egalitarian and accessible and empowering has been built upon. And I chose the examples of Ethereum and Cardano. There's so many good projects out there with a lot of talented people working on them. That's one extreme. At the other extreme, we have what may best be described as sleazy knockoffs that you should avoid as you would a live hand grenade. So no names will be mentioned. I'm not here to bash any ICOs. I'm a business owner myself, and I run an English school offline in Japan. I do a few online classes, but I know what it takes to start and run and to a degree succeed in a business. So I'm not a big fan of slander, or I guess in this case it would be slander and libel. Ooh. So anyways, my point is that when someone in the know tells you that 90% of what's out there is a scam, they're not joking in the world of cryptocurrencies. The figure of 90% may be a little harsh, but let it be known that there is a growing number of people out there looking to cash in on the trend as quickly and easily as possible, so please be careful. It's just one of those things, it's a fad, And the nature of cryptocurrencies makes it kind of easy to set up a scam. All you really need to do is build a website and, you know, build in the SEO for ICOs, and there are people out there, unfortunately, who will buy into that, and so it's be careful. Okay, that's enough of that. Okay. What is fiat currency? I've mentioned this. I think I'm going to change this a little bit, so talk a bit more about the history of fiat currency when I edit. So let's just get into the content here, never mind the title. First, fiat currencies are an outdated and highly unstable technology, and really one of the only things that keeps them going is tradition, and maybe a better way to say that would be the tradition of authority. So we know how authority, there's an effect where it tends to propagate itself, and it doesn't like to give up and go away of its own accord. So my shirt's all messed up. Anyways, so there's a momentum is probably the best word involved with fiat currency, and also a lot of, like, when I say a lot, like most of the world's financiers, as they're called, have a vested interest in fiat currency, despite the fact that it is monopoly money. So fiat, I should mention, in Latin means formal authorization, decree, and more accurately, an arbitrary order. So it basically means that someone in power can say, it's money, and then that's it. There's nothing else to it. So again, it has its utility, but it also has, as we're starting to see, far more shortcomings than it does strengths. Far more weaknesses than strengths. But that is not to say that the system doesn't work. Clearly, we've had our ups and downs, but to say that it's been a failure altogether wouldn't be quite accurate, although there are some that would disagree. And I kind of go on about that point here. But, you know, we've had some, I'm saying we, humanity is what I mean, have had some really rough times with economic bubbles and crashes, and unfortunately a lot of the people pulling the strings, they kind of just see it as the nature of the beast, and unfortunately it kind of is, because eventually the ability to print currency, or not, and these days they don't even have to print it. With fractional reserve banking, they can simply just generate it in a computer based off of a fractional amount of reserves, which means basically hyperinflation. As long as there's a need to use it, you know, it gets used. But my point is, eventually you can't put all of that out there without something happening. So that's why it is kind of the nature of the beast. They pump and pump and pump, and they don't necessarily dump, but eventually there's always a different, depending on the bubble, but the bubble pops. So in the case of our most recent blow up in 2008, the subprime lending scam basically led to a lot of other products being built on top of that. Very few of them were regulated, actually, and that's something a lot of people don't know. All of these derivatives and I forget the name off the top of my head, but the mortgage packs, where secured mortgage packages, I think they were called. People were just making money left and right off of these crazy schemes, and eventually the people who had taken out all these loans, it became widely realized, could not afford to pay them, and the products backing them up were unregulated. They were completely insubstantial, and it basically backflowed into the stock market, and the rest is history. So there's a lot more to it than that, but things like that are almost inevitable in a fiat currency economy. So we're going to go into that. What's wrong with fiat money? few points. Let me just say them outright and we'll go into them in detail. Instability, high susceptibility to corruption, high susceptibility to inflation, centralization, counterparty risk, coercion, and distribution of wealth or lack thereof. So let's go to the first one. Instability. So this point applies to other forms of currency as well. No currency is utterly unshakable if it is actually being used. You know, it's like the weather. We can't have sunny days all the time. Some are just more durable than others. But fiat money is particularly unstable because the nature of the lending and printing system breeds corruption and Ponzi schemes of all kinds, as we can see with our most recent example in 2008. The real problem is there's a human element, and that's very much an X factor. People will tend to take advantage of things, and I mean, come on, these guys can print the money out of nowhere and lend it almost out of nowhere. So what do you expect? Of course it's going to be unstable. There's also a high susceptibility to corruption. This brings us back to the human element. Generally people, especially if they have access to the printing presses or lending apparatus, it's really just statistically speaking a matter of time before they do something naughty. And of course, the more they do something naughty and get away with it, the more they're going to do it. So the tendency here is to push it as far as they can, and that has consistently been the case historically speaking, in light of economic crash after economic crash. So another point worth mentioning is that the people who do have this kind of authority also tend to insulate themselves from the effects of their own corruption, which kind of makes them even more corrupt. Anyways, high susceptibility to inflation. Again, printing presses and lending apparatus. You can make all the money you want to kind of satisfy demand or mask kind of problems in the market. As I say, these two elements have historically been employed to either smooth over or hide entirely real-world economic problems and troublesome fluctuations in market forces. So there's going to be ups and downs in any market, sometimes smaller or bigger, but if they're allowed to kind of auto-correct, generally they go away. But if you keep hiding them and keep piling more money on top to hide everything, those auto-corrections don't happen, and eventually the system fails. So one of the biggest causes is inflation, but there are other problems like predatory lending and unregulated financial products in the system. And on top of unregulated, sometimes these people don't even know how they work. And you have one layer of products like that, and on top of that, another layer of even more bizarre products, and eventually it's just a Ponzi scheme. Anyways, okay, centralization. This is a key word in a fiat currency system. The problem with a central point of control is that it also is a central point of failure. So that is, in a centralized system, all of the eggs are in one basket, as the old analogy goes. On the one hand, this makes management more concentrated, so if you are the privileged minority with all the authority, you guys can hang out together and you have access to everything from a central point. But on the other hand, it makes it much more vulnerable to such things as attack, manipulation, corruption, and or all of the above. Right? So if you have one central point of control, you also have one central point of failure, whether it's through failure of the system or corruption, which leads to failure of the system. And too much power in one spot is rarely proven to be a good thing. Okay, another fault or weak point is called counterparty risk. And this isn't so much with fiat currency in and of itself, but in comparison to cryptocurrency. So, and that is, counterparty risk can apply to a lot of currencies. It basically means the element of trust, right? So, even the most complex transactional systems involve an element of trust. This trust is included in both the counterparty, partner in the transaction, A, agreeing to fulfill their part of the transaction, and B, verifying that it has occurred. So, it might sound kind of technical, but first you need to be able to trust whoever you're dealing with and know that they will fulfill their part of the transaction. So if you give them $100 to put in your bank account, you need to be relatively sure they're going to do that. And then you need a way of verifying that it has occurred. Usually this is okay, but we tend to overlook what a vulnerable system this really is. And given a high enough level of access, or something like a complete collapse of one party's institution or loss of computer records, contracts, and account balances, everything becomes worthless. This is because there is no substantial existence to the currency in a fiat system. It is simply agreed to exist, as it is imposed by those with authority. This means there will always be an element of risk and theft in any transaction involving fiat currency. Always. It's more or less unavoidable. There is a high tendency among most of us to follow the rules and do the right thing, but the kind of unavoidable fact is that the nature of this system allows for a huge amount of leeway and just outright theft. If you're either in a position with enough authority to do it, or you just know how to do it. Either way. So that's a big problem with fiat currencies, and almost all currencies until recently. Okay, coercion. This one isn't mentioned a lot. I mentioned it in why the Wolf of Wall Street is wrong about Bitcoin. Fiat currency inevitably involves an element of coercion. It's devised and put into use by those in authority, so it must involve some level of coercion in order to ensure its continued acceptance. And generally, this isn't something we give much thought to. This is partly because A, we have almost no alternative, right? If you go down to your local grocery store and you say, I want to pay in Bitcoin, or I want to pay in clamshells, or British pounds, they're going to say no, and you can't buy any food. So that's pretty limiting, right? Not having an alternative. It's limiting once we realize that it's there and that other alternatives exist. Where were we? Yes. And so, another reason we don't give much thought to coercion, B, is the thought has been so excised from popular consideration that it's unlikely to occur to the average person as a thing remotely worth pursuing. But however, there was a time in the early 20th century where types of currency other than the US dollar were widely used in the United States. You can click the link here in the blog to learn a little bit more about that. It's an interesting history, and of course not just the US, the world. So, give a quick example of coercion by the state. So in 1933, when the dollar was removed from the gold standard, except in the international markets, the real face of coercion reared its head as the penalty for not accepting the new Federal Reserve notes in place of gold certificates was a $10,000 USD fine, 10 years in prison, or both. So that's pretty coercive. And this is when Federal Reserve notes came into use instead of gold certificates. So gold certificates used to represent a certain amount of gold for which they were redeemable. That's what gold standard means. That came to an abrupt end in 1933, and the government did not mess around when it came to enforcing it. Okay, and then another issue, it's often super subtle with cryptocurrency, is the distribution of wealth or lack thereof. So, given the nature of fiat currencies, i.e. they are basically created and controlled by a privileged minority, it is only a matter of time before the majority of the currency accumulates with those who create it. That is, with fiat currency, the money will flow to the financial institutions and through taxation to the government. And also the problem is that legislation can be written on multiple levels of government and for certain favored industries that tend to accelerate this process. So we hear time and again about the upward flow of wealth, particularly since the 1970s in the US. And so that's one factor. Another issue that we don't give much thought to, let me make sure it's not in here already. So imagine in 1980 you save $100, which would have been worth a lot back then, and you put it in your bank account, and you go to use it today. Oh, I had that $100. I'm gonna get it out of my bank account, and you get it out and you say, I'm gonna go buy a suit for $100, right? Good luck. It's the same money, but it's lost value, right? So, the way this happens is through inflation. And I'm going to quote this guy here. So, this is from John Meyer of theperfectcurrency.org. He says, fiat currency monetary systems are open to abuse by government and private interests alike. Banks and governments. Private interests would be someone who has a lot of power and money and authority, not necessarily your average Joe. Currency inflation is both the invisible tax of government and the large-scale fraud of private financial institutions. It is far easier to print more money than to serve up doses of fiscal reality to the masses. As long as fiat money is controlled by special interests, abuse and crisis will be constant. And so, it pretty much says it all. Inflation can be somewhat offset by compound interest. There are financial products that can kind of preserve the relative value of whatever you save. But generally speaking, it's very difficult to keep up in an economy that uses fiat currency. So this has to do with scarcity, and which helps maintain and also create a currency's value. We can imagine that if the number of US dollars in circulation were limited and the government was not allowed to print more, whatever we saved would maintain its relative proportions to the total. So $100 would still have its equivalent value compared to the total in circulation, right? That actually exists with some cryptocurrencies, which means they have an amazing potential as not only for an increase in value, but also as a store of value. So this is something we probably don't think about too much, since A, a lot of us are really used to living paycheck to paycheck, and B, it's just such a subtle part of the system. It's not widely discussed, and it kind of happens in the background. But as John Meyer calls it, the invisible tax of government and the large-scale fraud of private financial institutions is definitely there. So how does cryptocurrency compare? So now that we've kind of knocked fiat currency down a notch or two, let's compare it to the same points. Again, here I just mentioned there's a ton of different cryptocurrencies out there. It's really hard to talk about all of them in a general way without being inaccurate about most of them, actually. So For the sake of brevity, we will use Bitcoin as our main example. And to be fair, no, it is not the most efficient cryptocurrency out there, nor is it likely the one that will see mass adoption. A few reasons for that. But it is the original cryptocurrency, I should mention, of its kind, and the one that has successfully introduced a template that can be developed to a degree where it very easily could see mainstream adoption and thrive. So my point is, Bitcoin provides a template that could very well be the model for whatever cryptocurrency it is that does see mass adoption. And there could be many that do see mass adoption. But for the sake of this comparison here in mid-March of 2018, we will be using Bitcoin. Okay, so instability. How does Bitcoin measure up? First, it is not susceptible to the same kinds of schemes and manipulation as fiat money is. It cannot be printed or even duplicated. And so far, there is no way to employ anything approaching fractional reserve banking without introducing a second technology on top of it, which would, well, totally defeat the point, right? Bitcoin is Bitcoin. It can't be duplicated. It can't have its amount increased. So it offers a remarkable level of stability. Now, we might say, oh, but what about the prices? They're going up and down like crazy. This has more to do with people buying and selling and diving into and running away from the Bitcoin that's out there. Bitcoin right now is not actually being used as a currency in the same way that, that the US dollar is. And on top of that, it's also a very, very small market. So what would be very small fluctuations in a larger fiat currency market are almost like tidal waves in the cryptocurrency market. So we can't look at it at the Bitcoin market in 2018 and compare it very fairly to the fiat currency market in the same year. One is much, much, much larger and way more established, and I would add controlled than the other. Okay, returning back to instability, one point worth mentioning, Bitcoin can be increased, but only the number of Bitcoin in the world can be increased, but only through a highly complex process known as mining, and no single institution can have a monopoly on it. And I would also add that the process of mining is very labor and resource intensive, so it does cost money to do it, which means the effort expended does offer or instill a higher value than simply just printing it somewhere or summoning it out of thin air on a computer. Also, in regards to its stability, no single institution can have a monopoly on the circulation or holding of Bitcoin. The distributed nature of the technology and high security of wallets would make it prohibitively expensive to even attempt. Also, approximately 80% of all Bitcoin is already either in circulation or held in private wallets, and there is no way to coerce this away from its owners, at least not to any effective degree. So again, with the US dollar, they can do some pretty wacky things. They can definitely increase the amount of it, but they can also do things like tax it and reclaim it from companies. They can call in loans. There's all kinds of back doors to really pull the carpet out from people if they really, really want to. They can also do things if your money's in a bank and they zero in on you personally, which they can do because you need to be tied into the system to have a bank account. They can freeze account assets, which basically boils down to stealing your money out of your account, right? So the idea of doing this with Bitcoin it's almost impossible, which also plays into things like taxation. activities of the government. They would really need the full compliance and consent of the population for anything they wanted to do with the population's cryptocurrency. So this is a very interesting point, and again, you could probably write a book on this. So I'm kind of trying to keep things light and unfortunately somewhat more shallow than I'd like to. It's also kind of hard to talk for a long time. So anyways, next point, high susceptibility to corruption. Again, because Bitcoin exists on a distributed network that simply will not allow counterfeit or false transactions, the likelihood of a small minority of privileged individuals somehow manipulating the entire Bitcoin network is exceedingly small. This is especially true when we consider that those involved with the Bitcoin blockchain are distributed all over the planet in a mostly anonymous way. It's very hard to find out who they are or where they are. And given the nature of the Bitcoin community, most of them aren't going to want to play ball with some creepy government-sponsored Ponzi scheme anyways. So, high susceptibility to inflation. The total supply of Bitcoin is fixed. And it is, I would say, impossible to ever counterfeit anymore, as they simply will not be verified with a blockchain. So if anything, Bitcoin is a deflationary currency. This means that it is far more likely to go up in value than to go down. And again, people may say, wait, the volatility. Remember, Bitcoin is a tiny market and simply responds more violently to changes in market trends than more established currencies with far, far larger market caps. Okay, centralization. This is potentially one of the greatest problems with fiat currency. As I said before, centralization concentrates too much power in one place. Decentralization, on the other hand, does the opposite. This means that with the decentralized nature of Bitcoin, control is distributed over the entirety of the blockchain. There is no way for one actor to try anything shady and succeed, because the distributed ledger will automatically know the transaction is false. It won't be able to proceed. And so it kind of does away with, the old man behind the curtain, so to speak. Counterparty risk. So Bitcoin is what is known as a trustless network, and it doesn't mean it can't be trusted. Don't let him in my house. I don't trust him. It's not like that. What a trustless network means, there is no need to trust anyone when making a transaction. The element of counterparty risk is effectively done away with because the nature of the blockchain itself ensures integrity of the transaction and full verification. They're actually one and the same. If a transaction is not authentic, it cannot be successfully verified. So, aside from blowing fiat currency out of the water, it also does away with a lot of the extra legalities and costs involved in ensuring both parties involved in a transaction are acting honestly. So it actually could mean it would be a lot cheaper to run the banks and whatnot if they were using a blockchain technology. And things like security would be much, much easier. Okay, coercion. Again, because no one entity, be it a bank or a government, can exercise full control over the blockchain, it would be exceedingly difficult to use any element of coercion to control what people do and don't do with their Bitcoin. You would literally have to destroy, to be sure, every computer in the world, every server in the world, to wipe Bitcoin off the planet. It cannot be frozen or stolen in your account or taxed away without full voluntary consent. So, most of us, to a degree, we want to pay our taxes to help people out. Not everyone's like that. So, if they were to impose a Bitcoin tax, it would effectively have to be voluntary. You could, register somewhere it's debatable, but basically it would have to be voluntary. They couldn't force it upon you. So that does away with coercion. Okay, distribution or lack thereof. This is another element of fiat currency, which, blah, 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 screws people over. As we know, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin cannot be artificially increased. It means that your personal holdings will more or less retain their relative proportion to the entire amount available in circulation. They will hold their value and may even see it increase. Yes, more Bitcoin will continue to be mined, but their introduction into the market will be gradual and based on real work involved in mining. This means that they will have far less of an inflationary effect on the market, especially if both the use and demand continue to rise accordingly. So there is generally a need for more of a currency as the economy gets bigger and the demand for it gets higher, especially in the old world's analog economies where there simply would not have been enough coins for everyone, right? So with Bitcoin, they've made an allowance for that. There will be more Bitcoins introduced through mining, but not to a crazy degree where we'll have like trillions and trillions of Bitcoins. That will never happen. Bitcoin can be divided down to the 100 millionth. So we essentially will have enough Bitcoin for everyone, theoretically. But the value of it will be quite high if that ever happens. There's a lot of factors we just don't know enough about to speak with confidence here. But suffice to say, the distribution of wealth problem and loss of value problem is essentially done away with technologies like this. So that in a nutshell is how cryptocurrencies counter the faults of fiat currencies. On top of that, cryptos also offer several advantages that fiat money systems can't even begin to approach. And you can read more about this in our post, Why the Wolf of Wall Street is Wrong About Bitcoin. Near the end of the section, why are we hearing more and more about Bitcoin? In brief, the advantages are convenience, security, anonymity or privacy, opportunity, and independence. So all of these factors exist to a very large degree in Bitcoin and similar cryptocurrencies. Not so much with fiat, to say the least. But again, the fact is, at this point in history, we don't really have much of a choice, which is kind of what keeps the system going. It's like, do you want to go with door A, or do you want to go with door A? It's kind of where we're at. So be that as it may, there are alternatives in the works. So, final thoughts. Although the differences between fiat and crypto should be quite clear, it still remains extremely uncertain how things will go. There are a lot of special interests at play on the side of fiat currency. You can say that again, including all the central banks of the world and a good number of the governments as well. Oh boy, typo. Sorry about that. On top of the vested interests, we also have to remember the detail that the entire economy is running off of this right now. So an instant changeover would kind of be dicey. And there's also, it turns out, when you have something imposed on a population by an authority for an extended period of time, that actually becomes a cultural element, and we can see that in societies like North Korea. Although it's debatable how much the citizens in North Korea actually believe what they're being told. So maybe a better example is Saudi Arabia, right? So the extremely hyper-conservative faction of Islam, Wahhabism. A lot of the people in the population actually believe that, and even if, when I say believe that, I'm not trying to bash Islam here. I'm saying they take the tenets of such an extreme interpretation very, very seriously, to the point where they feel uncomfortable about women driving cars or showing their faces. Even if those in power have more exposure to the outside world and are able to converse with different ideas very comfortably, they're outnumbered, and their people can't do that. So in the case of cryptocurrencies, acceptance doesn't just rely on the governments and the banks saying, okay, let's do cryptocurrencies. It's also going to rely on the people accepting them, and which would also take time. So anyways, on the side of cryptocurrency, although there are clear systemic and technological advantages, there is a huge X factor. There is, that is, no one can truly say how things would go if mass adoption were to occur. The idea of a mass changeover would probably take quite a bit of time, political finagling, and a customization by the populations of the world. It would not happen overnight, and the form it may happen in would likely be very different from how we currently imagine it. So, this is true with a lot of technologies. You know, they start off as an idea, inception, and they progress through phases of development and trial and error and acceptance until we end up with what we have. But until that time comes, it's really, really almost impossible to predict what that form will be. So where we are now with cryptocurrencies is very, very, very near the beginning. It's very early days. So as I said, it's hard to say where things are going to go and how they'll change. But one thing is for sure, this standoff between cryptocurrency and fiat currency cannot continue forever. Things will change as they inevitably have to. So politics, vested interests, revolutions and whatnot aside, let's hope the change is a peaceful and beneficial one. Okay, so thank you for reading, and in your case, if you're watching the video, thank you for watching. Real quick, as I always do, are you interested in getting involved with cryptocurrencies? So if you want to learn more about the service providers we work with, we work with currently Mintage Mining and Crypto World Evolution. You can click through to learn more about them, or you can email us to just kind of suggest a blog post maybe. You can also do that by commenting on the video below or visiting our blog. We're pretty old school. We don't use automated emails, no affiliate link buttons, no hiding who we are. My name is Trevor. I am the face behind BitcoinBuildify.com. I hope you liked what you saw and or listened to in this video, and I hope to stay in touch with you. One quick thing down here. This is a great video on the economics of non-scarce resources by Jeffrey Tucker. Really amazing speaker, and an amazing thinker as well. I'd recommend you look into what he says as well. Pretty amazing guy. So with that, thank you guys for watching and listening. Stay in touch. Don't be shy about subscribing, clicking the like button and whatnot. And until next time, enjoy crypto, but always do your due diligence. Okay, good night.